As some of you perhaps already know, C.S. Lewis was a bachelor until he was 58 years old, and when he did marry, it was under most unusual circumstances. His wife was named Joy Davidman. She was an American Jewess. She graduated from Hunter College in the early 1930s, and like so many of the idealists of that era, she thought the Communist Party represented the best hope for the future. So she not only joined the party, but she went to Russia to directly participate in the great experiment. She met there another American of similar persuasion, and they were married. The events of the 1930s and 40s, and particularly the rise of Stalinism, shattered any hope she might have for that ideology. Like so many people, communism became for her the god that failed. And she found herself cut adrift on a sea of intellectual and spiritual uncertainty. She had lost touch with her Jewish roots. She had been betrayed by a hollow ideology. And in that vacuum period, she happened to encounter some of the addresses that C.S. Lewis had given over the BBC during World War II. They had been collected under the title Mere Christianity. And that slim little volume became the catalyst of a profound conversion to Christianity. Because she was anxious to learn more about her newly discovered faith, she moved to Oxford, where he was teaching, and the two of them became good friends, and he became her spiritual mentor. Her husband did not share this newest enthusiasm. In fact, very soon he abandoned her and her two children, went back to the States, filed for divorce, and very quickly remarried. And not too long after that, Joy Davidman herself was diagnosed with a lethal bone cancer and given almost no chance to survive. Because she had not been a British citizen, because she had this background in communism, the authorities were threatening to deport her, and Lewis proposed to marry her in the hospital room, that through that marriage she might at least have the possibility of staying in England and dying in peace. Now, those of you who know anything about cancer know that it's a mysterious and elusive disease, and as quickly as it had come upon her, it suddenly went into remission. In other words, for all practical purposes, she was completely healed. Both of them interpreted this as a sign from God. And so they began to live together, and from all reports, fell passionately in love. In fact, it seemed that they were united in body, mind, and spirit. They did experience the mutual joy our prayer book speaks of as God's purpose for marriage. And then as quickly as the cancer had left, it came back again, and in a matter of weeks, she died in the Ratcliffe Infirmary there in Oxford. Her death was a devastating blow to C.S. Lewis. He had commented to a friend that what had been denied him in his 20s had miraculously been given him in his 50s. And then just when he had developed the taste for this wonderful food, it was heartlessly snatched away from him. Lewis had long had the habit of keeping a personal journal, and so almost from the moment of Joy's death, he began to write down in great detail the experiences that came after he moved through the valley of the shadow of grief. And right before his own death in 1963, he was persuaded to publish that part of his journal in a little book entitled A Grief Observed. If you have ever encountered that little book, I think you'll agree with me that it's one of the most honest and searing descriptions of the experience of bereavement that you will ever find. Lewis makes no attempt from the first to hide his disappointment in what his faith had meant to him in the midst of his grief. He had expected consolations in the valley of the shadow of loss, and when he got there, lo and behold, they did not materialize. And so he reacts with all of the vehemence of a person who feels they have been betrayed. He acts like a man who's been sold a bill of goods, who is the victim of false advertising. He rails against God with the same kind of intensity that you find in the book of Job. In fact, it is awesome to read some of his words. And yet, whatever else you say about C.S. Lewis, he was not superficial. He was persistent. And so he continued to grapple with his grief, the same way that Jacob had grappled with the angel through the night. And as the little book unfolds, you begin to sense a subtle shift taking place. What happened was he began to look at his actual experiences and not his expectations. You see, he had built up ahead of time what he thought ought to happen when he experienced grief, and when it didn't happen that way, he found himself greatly in pain. However, he decided that maybe he ought to look at what had actually happened, not what he thought should have happened. That is, to sit down before fact and not fancy like a little child. And as he begins to work with the actualities of his experience, lo and behold, he starts discovering that goodness and mercy had accompanied him in that dark terrain, but because they were in a different form than he had anticipated, he had missed them at first. As he begins to deal with actualities, the whole mood begins to shift, and the little book ends on a much more hopeful note than it began. I can still remember reading that book at one sitting and being absolutely awed by its honesty. This was years before I myself was thrust into the valley of the shadow of bereavement. And yet I remember saying to myself, how can we handle the promises of God responsibly? How can we keep people from being set up for this kind of disappointment? There is no doubt that the Bible speaks again and again of a hope that people can have from God. This one is described by the psalmist as our refuge and our strength, a very present help in time of trouble. St. Paul exclaims, my God shall supply all of your needs according to his riches and glory. The prophet Isaiah said, they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. These words suggest that God does something for people in the midst of history, particularly in their times of difficulty. And I found myself asking, how can we speak of this hope in ways that will really help people and not set them up for disillusionment? It seems to me that our gospel reading of the morning is a beautiful answer to that question that was posed by the book of Grief Observed. If you will listen carefully to what Jesus has said as remembered by Luke, he is also incredibly honest about the way it can be in this kind of world, and yet he is also hopeful in the most authentic way. We need to look at those words more carefully. What Jesus says here was triggered initially by some people standing out before Herod's great temple in Jerusalem and rhapsodizing about how beautiful it was, how eternal it appeared, how absolutely magnificent and trustworthy that particular structure was. And they must have been shocked when Jesus says, you can't put your trust in things even that great. He said, before you hardly know it, this building that you see is going to collapse altogether. Not one stone is going to be left on another. Well, these people could hardly believe such a dire prediction. You see, that temple had been built 46 years before by Herod the Great. It was the third temple to exist on that particular site. Herod had gone to every expense possible in building an architectural masterpiece. The exterior was covered with gold. To see it at a distance, it shimmered like an exquisite jewel. It was the very seat and symbol of God's presence. It was the main industry in Jerusalem. In fact, every hope that those people had was somehow symbolized in the grandeur and the eternality of that particular building. And yet Jesus sensed, in ways that his contemporaries did not, that there was a poison at work in that culture that was destined for a collision with disaster. You see, there was a pride in the Jewish people that they had never let go of. They thought chosen people meant that they were destined to rule everybody else, and therefore they were continually involving themselves in violence, always trying to throw out the Romans, always trying to foment a revolution. And Jesus knew, as he said on another occasion, they don't know the things that make for peace. In other words, they were living in loveless ways in a world that is rooted and grounded in love, and that will always lead to disaster. I've referred before to an old Yiddish saying that if a chicken challenges an elephant to a fight, the chicken better be agile. In other words, if a tiny amount of strength provokes a great amount of power, the chances of not being hurt are almost none. And that's what Jesus sensed the Jewish people of Jerusalem were doing. There was a zealot party that was always provoking Rome, always trying to do something violent. And the truth is that less than 4 decades after Jesus spoke these words, the Roman Empire finally had had enough of these Jewish insurrectionists. They sent in a whole host of legion. They laid siege to Jerusalem and cut off all the food supplies. And when the populace was weakened, they stormed the gates. They ransacked the city. They set fire to Herod's fabled temple. The gold overlay melted and ran down between the stones. And because the Roman legions were allowed to loot, they literally took one stone off the other in order to get to that molten gold. And the city of David was leveled into a city of shambles. And Jesus was telling the people that they were on collision course with disaster because they were being loveless in a world that is rooted and grounded in love. And he says this is going to continue as long as people try to live by violence instead of to live by the way of love. In fact, he gives all kinds of dire predictions about wars and rumors of wars, all kinds of calamities, social disintegration, where family members turn against family members. He makes the most dire prediction of what can happen in a world where lovelessness is often the dominant principle. But at the same time, he offers a hope in the midst of this dire prospect that is absolutely rock-like. For example, he says, if you are dragged before the authorities, as you may well be, because to live by the way of love in a loveless culture can bring you into conflict. If you're dragged before authorities, don't worry about what you're going to say ahead of time, because I will give you the words. I will provide you the wisdom. And I promise that no matter how bad it gets, you will not be destroyed. Not a hair of your head will be absolutely decimated. You will survive because of me. And what it seems like to me Jesus is saying here is that we are promised empowerment and not exemption. We are never promised by Jesus that if we rest in him it's going to be easy or pleasant, or that bad things are never going to happen. We are never given the illusion that if we give ourselves to Jesus, everything is going to be simple. What we are promised are 3 very crucial things. First, he says, I will be with you no matter what. I will give you what you need as you need it. As your days, so will your strength be. And I will not forsake you or abandon you. Jesus promises to be with us in the midst of the uncertain future. He promises empowerment and not exemption from suffering. I remember back in the 60s hearing a great black preacher retell the Old Testament story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were 3 Hebrew young men who were captured in Jerusalem and taken east to Babylon to live in exile. And when they got over there, the authorities demanded that they do some things that violated the very core of their conscience. They were asked to profane some things that they considered sacred, and they refused to do it. Well, the Oriental tyrants of Babylon were not used to civil disobedience. They were not used to a citizen saying, I won't do what I'm being commanded to do. And so the king threatened them with throwing them into a fiery furnace if they did not comply. You need to realize that Hitler was not the first one to invent the crematorium. He was not the first tyrant to use the threat of death by fire as a way of getting people to do what he wanted to do. But even that threat did not intimidate the young Hebrews. They stood firm. And so the king had the crematorium fired up. He went down himself and gave the order when the flames were the hottest that these 3 were to be cast into the midst of the flame. And then the king got the greatest shock of his life. As those 3 were thrown into the fire, he looked And lo and behold, they were walking around in the midst of it as if they were untouched by the flame. And there was a fourth presence in there with them, a symbol of the one who promised, I will be with you wherever you go. And at that point, the old black preacher, I'll never forget it, paused dramatically and said, God does not deliver us from the flames. He delivers us in the flames. He promises us empowerment. He doesn't promise us exemption. And I believe that against any kind of future that we can imagine or project, any kind of terrible thing that can happen in a loveless culture, to have these three rock-like promises, I will be with you like that fourth figure in the fire. I will provide for you as your days, so will your strength be. And I will not forsake you. I will not abandon you. Nothing can separate you from my love. This is the hope that Jesus offers that will not be disappointed. And this morning I imagine that there are many of you here who could stand up and in your own words say, I have found that to be the living truth. I have been in hard and incredibly difficult places, and in those moments I was not alone. I remember when I learned it for myself so distinctly. Saturday afternoon, January the 10th, 1970. For months I had watched the disease of leukemia ravage the body of my little girl. We had done everything we knew to do medically, religiously, and yet the relentless pursuit of that disease was awesome. I remember thinking in the last weeks, if she dies, I'm going to die. I cannot stand it. I will not be able to bear a pain that is that intense and that separating. I remember thinking, if she dies, I will come to an end myself. But that Saturday afternoon, with the snow falling softly outside her window, all of us standing around the bed, she breathed her last. And the doctor said, she's gone. And all I can tell you is that what I didn't think I could possibly stand, somehow I did. There came a strength from somewhere that not only gave her the courage to die with incredible peace, but there was also a gentle stream that came and floated me in ways that I had never experienced before. Something from somewhere else came in the midst of that crisis, as surely as that fourth figure appeared in the midst of those flames. And looking back, I don't know how I did it. Looking toward it, I didn't think I could stand it. But lo and behold, the promise was true. He was there, and he did provide, and he will provide. And this morning, that's the hope that will not disappoint. That's the hope that you can rest your life on as you look into the future. I have no idea what's going to happen to any of us. I have a good friend right now who is losing his sight, and in a matter of weeks, he's probably going to be totally blind, and it seems so awesome to have to surrender the gift of vision. I find myself saying, I don't know what I would do if that happened. I have no assurance that the people I love most will not in some way have to leave. We are not promised exemption. We are promised empowerment. And if you will rest your life on the threefold promises, I will be with you, I will provide, I will not forsake you, and realize that you have those promises on the word of a gentleman of the most impeccable honor. On those promises, no matter what, you will not only survive, but you will grow. That's a hope that will not disappoint.